Good afternoon, everyone. We're so excited to have you with us today. My name is Leslie Milano, and I'm the president of the Women's Democratic Club. We're very excited to have Representative John Sarbanes with us today. But first, we want to tell you a little bit about WDC. For over 60 years, the WDC has been a vibrant network of politically active women and men. We're active on the local, state, and national levels. We're advocating for the increased role of women in our democracy, championing issues that are important to women and families, and working to keep all members of our society engaged and informed. We would like you to join us at WDC. We're in the midst of our membership campaign. In addition to joining, if you're interested in getting a little bit more active, we have a few openings within our committees. And if you're interested in either of those opportunities, membership in general, or being part of our committee, please go to womensdemocratic.club.org and send us an email. We'll be very excited to get back in touch with you, let you know what the opportunities are. This exciting speaker series is just one of the ways that we work to accomplish our goals. Past speakers include Kristen Clark, Assistant Attorney General, Representative Jamie Raskin, Representative John Sarbanes, who we're going to speak with again today, Dr. Fiona Hill, Senator Mark Warner, and many others listed here. These are just our recent WDC events. We also lobby in Annapolis. We have a very robust advocacy committee. We organize candidate forums, so look out for us to we have candidate forums, 3 of them, in fact, in late April and early May. So that'll be in our newsletter, which is switching to a monthly newsletter, and that should be released at the very beginning of December. We also advocate for critical issues, support Democratic candidates at every level of government. And we're excited for you to join us in doing that. Our next speaker is Jennifer Rubin. She's an author, columnist, and commentator. And we will be speaking with her on Tuesday, November 30th at 12:30. If you haven't registered already, go to our website and you can register there today. Representative Sarbanes will speak today about HR 1 and many other issues. And you can submit your questions starting now via chat by going to our chat function and connecting with the participant called Q&A. If you're an elected official, please also message me so that we can recognize you. And today's special guest is Representative John Sarbanes. He serves on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce as Vice Chair of the House Subcommittee on Health and is a member of the House Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change. He sits on the House Committee on Oversight and its Government Operations Subcommittee. He is the author of HR 1. He's been here with us at WDC to speak about it before in the past. It's the For the People Act, and it is targeting how to fix our democracy and give voice back to the people. We actually have a slide on that here as well. There's 3 components of HR 1, 3 main components. There's clean and fair elections, there's ending big money in our politics, and also having greater ethics enforcement as well. So we are really excited to bring in John Sarbanes today and for you to ask all of your questions. We're already getting some, so we are very excited to hand it over. And without further ado, Representative John Sarbanes.
Well, thank you very much, Leslie. It's great to be with everybody today. Thanks for inviting me back. It's always a good sign when you speak to a group and they want to have you come talk to them again. A lot going on in Washington. It's sort of like there's a lot of planes in the air that we're trying to land every single day. And Speaker Pelosi is a magician when it comes to that kind of thing. And certainly the last few weeks have been quite a challenge in terms of making sure that the Democratic caucus in the House stayed together in order to get important things over the finish line. Let me just salute WDC for your outstanding work, not just for the opportunity to bring in people and talk about the issues of the day, but the way that you organize, keep your members informed, keep them active and engaged. That's what we need in our democracy right now, is people that are stepping up every single day to find a way to connect to keeping the democracy strong and fortified. So thank you for all the work that you do day in and day out. I thought what I would do, and I want to keep most of the time for questions because I know we'll have some, and that's always the better dynamic. Give you a little bit of an update, a broad update on all the things going on, and then I'll zero in particular on the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and we can go from there. We just about an hour plus ago passed in the House of Representatives, you've probably seen breaking news, the Buildback Better Act, which is a transformational bill. I mean, the scope of this is fairly unprecedented. You have to go back to the New Deal to find something that's this potentially impactful. I say potentially because it's not law yet. It has to get through the Senate, and there will be changes in the Senate. We're anticipating that. But I think what we're sending to the Senate is a very, very robust set of priorities. And I don't want to leave out some good things. So I'm going to give you a quick kind of rundown, the menu of some of the things that are included in the Build Back Better Act. First is it makes the largest investment in childcare and early education that we've ever seen in the history of this country. It would provide access to childcare just in the state of Maryland for 373,000 children ages 0 to 5. It would keep the expense of childcare low, much lower than many families are experiencing right now by ensuring that families pay no more than 7% of their income on high quality childcare. So really transformational, groundbreaking, obviously supports families, particularly women in the workforce, to have that kind of resource available at an affordable expense. This would provide universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds across the country. This would be free, high quality preschool in Maryland. Again, about 138,000 children that would benefit from this. So just that alone is seismic when you think about it. And certainly Speaker Pelosi always puts these investments in terms of what it means for the children. That's her mantra. In addition, it would take meaningful steps, not as significant as we had hoped originally, but still quite substantial steps in terms of addressing climate change. Again, the largest investment to combat climate change in American history. It would set the U.S. on course to meet the goals, the climate target goals of reducing by 50 to 52% the greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 when compared to the levels of 2005. It invests in very significant things like the Civilian Climate Corps, a whole set of green job programs, clean energy tax incentives. It imposes polluter fees in a meaningful way that we think will cut back significantly on our carbon footprint as a nation, and otherwise sets us on a course that we can build upon. We know coming out of COP26 that there was some disappointment that countries around the world, including the United States, were not a little more concrete in terms of their commitments. But there's no question that the Build Back Better Act sets the table for meaningful leadership on the part of the United States when it comes to climate change. And then just quickly, some other things, because I don't want to miss these. Increasing Pell Grant awards by $550, which would benefit in Maryland about 85,000 students. Training workers through community college partnerships, workforce training programs there. Improves nutrition for children and families, those options available. Expands opportunities for affordable housing. The effort is to build over 1 million affordable housing units across the country. If you're familiar with this at all, you know that there's an absolute shortage. And we have families that are living on the street or in homeless shelters. because there's simply no affordable housing out there for them to access. A meaningful set of improvements in terms of people's access to health care. I want to mention for seniors that we are now going to give Medicare the ability to negotiate on the cost of prescription drugs. It's the first time ever in a meaningful way. That will help to reduce those costs, capping seniors' out-of-pocket drug expenses at $2,000 a year, which is a big deal because the average now is about $3,200 per year for that kind of cost. So this would substantially lower that expense for people. And adding hearing benefits to Medicare, which is a major expansion of the Medicare benefit structure, something very meaningful to many people out there. Supporting families with long-term care needs, and extending the child tax credit, which, as you know, was part of the American Rescue Plan, provided $3,600 or $3,000, depending on the age of your child, for families with children across the country. And Maryland had an incredible impact, reduced childhood poverty through that tax credit by 50% nationally. This would extend that by another year, on the way to our making it a permanent tax credit available to families with children. These are just some of the things that are included in Build Back Better. There's a lot of momentum behind it. It's going to the Senate. There will be some challenges over there and some other things that have to be reconciled. But I think at the end of this process, it will still be at a scale and a scope that is historic and have a transformationally positive impact on the quality of life of people all across this country, and certainly in our state. So that's a report on what we did today. Just to finish out the broad framework before I turn to voting rights, this is the third of three legs and kind of the three-legged stool of the Build Back Better agenda that President Biden came into office promising to deliver. The first was the American Rescue Plan. We passed that back at the beginning of the year. This was to address the pandemic, and there's been real positive consequence from all of those investments in terms of helping us get to the other side of this very challenging public health crisis. The second piece was what we passed a couple weeks ago, which was the bipartisan infrastructure investment bill, which will bring it's a $1.2 trillion bill, but $550 billion of that is new monies going to fix roads, bridges, tunnels, investing in our ports, our airports, railroads, public transit, broadband, fixing our water infrastructure, really a mammoth investment. So you put the American Rescue Plan together with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, with the Build Back Better Act, and what it represents is an unprecedented and historic investment in our country at a moment when we desperately need that. So I'm excited about it. We'll see again where the final version of Build Back Better ends up. But I think we're in a good place. The important thing is we got to get out there now, tell people what we did as Democrats. That's always kind of the hard part for us. We do these great things. We have to convert on that, make sure people understand what we've done so we can lift that up and come into next year's election with really, the wind beneath our sails. And I think that, or beneath our wings. And I think we can do that. Let me talk about where we are with freedom to vote, because I've spent 15 years on this, most intensely over the last 5 years, and in a way that probably occupies like 95% of my time over the last year. And I want to thank the club for your continued support of this effort, raising your voice, keeping the temperature high out there in the public. It's made a huge difference to getting us to where we are at this point. H.R. 1, the For the People Act, was the bill that was pulled together over a period of 2 or 3 years in the House of Representatives. I was privileged to be kind of the architect and assembler of that that piece of legislation. We passed it in the 116th Congress on March 8th. We passed it again in the 117th Congress on March 3rd, and then off it went to the United States Senate. When it went there in the last Congress, it died on arrival because Mitch McConnell was standing there blocking the door with his arms folded. Its arrival in the Senate this year came with some possibility because obviously the Democrats hold the gavel in the Senate. The challenge, of course, is we've got to get a rules change over there to get past the 60-vote supermajority requirement. And I am sure we will talk more about that. So I'm going to keep moving and we can come back to it. What's included in this bill, again, I hate to keep using this word transformational because I don't want it to lose its impact. But when you look at voting rights and civil rights, Eric Holder, civil rights experts, voting rights historians have all said that this will be the most significant piece of legislation passed since the 1965 Voting Rights Act. What does it do? It makes sure that there's fair access to the ballot box in America by making registering and casting your vote more convenient everywhere in the country. We can talk more about the details, but things like access to mail-in voting on a no-excuse basis everywhere in the country, 15 days of early voting, automatic voter registration, online registration, and same-day registration. It addresses partisan gerrymandering. We'll probably talk about that today. Across the country, setting baseline standards on how you draw congressional districts in a way that respects the voters. That's included in this transformational bill. It addresses newly, this is a new addition to the bill, the issue of election subversion or sabotage, which is the new threat that has emerged around the country. This idea that state level officials can reach down, summarily dismiss local election officials if they don't like what the vote count is there. This sort of contagion we're witnessing of harassment and intimidation of election officials and poll workers. So it puts protections in against those kinds of threats to the basic infrastructure of our democracy. That's a new piece that we added when we saw what was emerging. It addresses foreign interference in our elections. We know that's critical. We've seen recently more news about how foreign money finds its way into our elections in a fashion that undermines the kind of connective tissue of our democracy. And lastly, as was mentioned, it pushes back against the undue influence of the big money crowd, the insiders, the special interests that for years have been blocking, using their money and their lobbyists and their sway, have been blocking good public policy. Wall Street calling the shots on tax policy, the gun lobby pushing off on reasonable gun safety rules, the fossil fuel industry holding us back from doing what's right on climate change, big pharma calling the shots on prescription drug pricing, et cetera. Everywhere you look, money finds a way to get in the way of the people's will. And this bill is designed to bring transparency to expose that agenda, that inside agenda. Put it all together, that's the Freedom to Vote Act. Now, just so you can connect the dots here, the bill started as H.R. 1 for the People Act in the House of Representatives. Its new incarnation in the United States Senate is the Freedom to Vote Act. It has essentially all the basic components in place that were there originally, and some additional ones that I mentioned. So if we could get this over the finish line, it would absolutely transform the democratic infrastructure in our country in a way that I think can protect our democracy going forward. The Freedom to Vote Act was put together by, well, many people, but there was a group of 8 senators who over the summer worked to come up with kind of a streamlined version of the original bill. It included Joe Manchin. And so this is a bill that he supports, he views as having ownership of it. And that's important because when the Republicans stand against it, as they've done foursquare, they're now standing against something that Joe Manchin wants to see get done. That increases the chances that he'll consider in a meaningful way a change to the rules. Lastly, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is designed to strengthen Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to have the traditional protections there, restore a pre-clearance formula to address places around the country where there's historic pattern of discrimination in voting based on race. The Republicans have stood against that bill in the Senate. So that's the other piece of the puzzle that we want to get over the finish line if we can get a rules change. So a lot going on. I didn't even mention keeping the government open, which we have to do past December 3rd. I didn't mention raising the debt limit, which we have to do at the latest, according to Janet Yellen, by December 15th. I didn't talk about the National Defense Authorization Act that they're working on in the Senate. There's a lot going on. I think we can get it all done, but I got to tell you, I'm most focused on the democracy and voting rights bills because all this other stuff we want to do, if we don't actually have a functioning democracy, and the alternative, by the way, if you look at what's coming at us from the other side, is an authoritarian regime, frankly. You're not going to get any of the other things that the American people need and want. So this is threshold stuff. It's existential. It's why I've committed so much of my life in politics to these issues. And again, I want to thank you because at every point along the way, when the pundits and the inside the beltway wise guys and the press were writing epitaphs about this legislation, the public refused to give up. I say it's like they had a memo that John Lewis wrote to them before he died, where he said, never give up and never give in. That's like in the subject line. That's what he would always say to us. And there's no question people around the country aren't giving up on this thing. They want their democracy. They showed up last November, 150 million strong, historic, and pulled their democracy back from the brink. And now they're looking to their lawmakers to see if we're going to be equal partners in that effort to rescue the democracy and strengthen it going forward. So thank you for being part of this loud and relentless chorus across the country to save our democracy. I hope that's going to happen in a meaningful way with passage of this legislation. And I think we can do it in the coming weeks. So with that, let me turn it back over to you, Leslie. Again, appreciate the opportunity. Happy to answer any questions I can from the group.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Wow, that was a really so informative. And I have so many questions here that have come in as you're talking. But before I get to them, I just want to say there's two other members of the audience that I wanted to have a shout out for here. We have Marley Pasternak from Senator Cardin's office, and also Marcy Frosch from Attorney General Brian Frosch. So thanks so much for representing them here today. So thanks so much, Representative Sarbanes. Wow. Let's get right into these questions. We have a few about the Buildback Better Act. One is, if we get resistance in the Senate, would you advocate for watering down the House version, bringing it for an up or down vote, or reintroducing it next year?
I think as a practical matter, the way this is going to go is the Senate's going to make changes to this. We know that already. So they're going to come up with their version of it. And then it will come back to the House in that kind of new framework. And we'll have to make a decision at that point. Is it close enough? Does it retain enough of the core elements that we should pass it and get it done? If we don't, in a sense, we have to start the reconciliation process all over again. And given how long it's taken just to get to this point, I think people are reluctant to do that. So I think what you're going to see is House Democrats leaning in as hard as they can to the Senate conversation over the next couple of weeks, and trying to present some leverage here. I mean, because ultimately we can withhold our votes on a bill that comes back. But I think as a practical matter, the president's going to be pushing very hard for us all to kind of reach an agreement. And look, it's Senate Democrats that are negotiating with themselves. So there are certainly advocates within the Senate caucus for what the House has already put into this bill. And I think they will be negotiating very strongly to make sure that it doesn't get diluted in a way that then makes it sort of anathema to House support. So I think that's how it's going to go. Just so you understand, one of the conversations that's happened around Build Back Better, because in some minds it started as a project at $6 trillion. Then it got, in conversations, reduced to $3.5 trillion. Then from $3.5 trillion, it got down to the current size of about $1.85 trillion. And there was pretty spirited discussion about, if you have a whole set of priorities and you do need to reduce the funding somewhat, do you accomplish that by eliminating completely some of those priorities? Or do you do it by keeping a lot of them in the mix, but reducing the investment in each one of them, where maybe you can't take something out 5 years, you take it out 2 years? I think that there was a little bit of both done, but I think there was a sense that if you could get started on certain things, particularly things that the public, I believe, will really champion and grab onto and not want to let go, kind of the way they did with the Affordable Care Act, that if you can get those out there for the next year or 2 years or 3 years, you've set the table for the political support to ultimately get that to be a permanent change, a permanent policy. And so that's kind of how this has all been coming together. But I think we're going to be looking carefully at the Senate, obviously supporting those Democratic senators that are advocating for the basic core of what we've sent them. And I think we'll end up with a good bill that will continue to make it a really amazing difference for people.
Great, thank you. Next question is, how long will it take for the infrastructure and Build Back Better funds to actually be available, to quote, start digging dirt?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, in theory, these funds will become available quite quickly. How quickly they can actually flow into projects so that you can be, driving your car and point to a construction site and say, well, that's Build Back Better investment happening right over there. That's a little more difficult, because these projects, even when they're funded, a new project can take years to kind of get off the drawing board and actually into execution. So I think what you're going to see first, from all the various jurisdictions that are benefiting, and this money is flowing to states and then out to counties, for example, in Maryland. What you're going to see first is a lot of repair projects where you've got existing infrastructure and you need to upgrade it, because that's what can be deployed most quickly. And then over time, you'll see some of these larger projects begin to get rolled out. And it depends what we're talking about. Again, roads and bridges, they have a certain set of specs that govern them. The Maryland port may have some things that are eligible right away to get started. Obviously, upgrading public transit, which I'm very, very interested in. I wish we had even more investment here. Requires a different kind of approach. Broadband deployment, water infrastructure. I mean, to be honest, these are all projects that can range from a year to 25 years. Right. But it's the biggest investment. I mean, you know how it is. We've been walking around for years complaining about how we've got pipes that are dating from 1905 and collapsing bridges and all this kind of stuff. You can't fix that overnight, but what you can do overnight is create the funding that will allow that effort to fix our infrastructure broadly across the country to begin and to be sustained over a period of time. And frankly, to increase our competitiveness as a country. One of the things the president keeps saying is we now rank 13th in the world in terms of our infrastructure, which is ridiculous. We used to be at the top. You can't be competitive. You can't be productive in terms of your economy if you don't have world-class infrastructure. This bill will allow us to begin deploying world-class infrastructure. One other thing I just want to mention, because I'm very focused on this, is we have the funding. We're going to have a lot of projects underway. One thing we have to keep in mind is where's the workforce going to come from? Because you can't just overnight train all the people that you're going to need, make sure you have the skilled workers in all of the different job categories. So it's going to put pressure on workforce development. And I think that states like Maryland and jurisdictions like Montgomery County and other counties across our state, as they're beginning to execute on this, they need to be thinking about how to grab onto the workforce and also make sure those job opportunities get to diverse communities. So it's not just sort of the usual suspects that step into the opportunity, that it's broadly distributed. I think we can do that, but we have to keep our eyes on the ball.
Thanks. Next question is, what is the status of negotiations to push voting through the Senate past the filibuster?
Yeah, so that's the $6 million question. So here's how I would describe what's going on. We know we need to get Joe Manchin to to get comfortable with changing the rules of the Senate. Now, he has been pretty explicit that he doesn't want to get rid of the filibuster. But he appears to be open to the idea of how could you fix the filibuster so that it could actually operate as an instrument that promotes debate, deliberation, compromise, make sure the minority voices in the chamber are heard, but cannot be turned into a weapon of obstruction, which is how it's been used by Mitch McConnell and the Republicans, certainly over the last 2 or 3 Congresses. What that looks like ultimately, we'll see. I think it will include things like no longer can you filibuster motions to proceed, which are simply an effort to go have a debate. Forget about the bill itself. Just to be able to debate the bill, you got to get through a filibuster, which is crazy because if you think the filibuster should be used to promote debate, why would you let it be used as a tool to stop debate? So that's an area where he's receptive. In fact, he supported legislation back in 2011 that would change that. Another thing is, instead of being able to filibuster by just filing a paper from your armchair, you should have to go down to the floor of the Senate, stand up, and hold the floor. And right now, you don't have to do that. So if a senator wants to go down there and hold the floor, that's fine. We ought to create that opportunity and change the rules to require it, frankly. He's open to that as well. So there's a sense that if you can present this as restoring the functioning of the Senate, which is now broken, it doesn't operate, that Joe Manchin could be there for that rules change. So that's the first thing. The second thing that makes us hopeful is that Manchin had plenty of time to chase Republicans. He kept saying, oh, we got to have Republicans on this. Something as important as voting rights, you've got to do it in a bipartisan way. Okay. In theory, I agree with that, and you should certainly start there. But he spent months trying to find Republican partners for the Freedom to Vote Act and for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And he can't find one senator. Lisa Murkowski voted to proceed to debate on John Lewis voting rights. But in her speech, before she cast the vote, she threw shade on the whole thing. She gave it the back of her hand. And it was really because she was just trying to straddle some political challenges she has with the Native American community in Alaska. So it's kind of a cynical position for her to take. But in any event, you weren't getting anywhere near 10 Republicans, which is what you needed to get to 60. So they've demonstrated they're not showing up, which puts it in the Democrats' court. We have to figure out a path forward. There are now very intense conversations going on within the Democratic caucus among senators about what would a rules change look like. And these are conversations that Joe Manchin is part of, and he's not getting up and walking out of the room. And that's a good sign. Now, does that mean that he will ultimately walk through that door and into the light and make the rules change that we need? There's no guarantees, but he's moving towards it. And I think that if Joe Biden is next to him saying, we got to go through that door, and his colleagues are saying, we need you to go through that door. And by the way, if on the other side of that door, there's a stadium full of cheering Americans, including cheering West Virginians, because he's being quite celebrated in his own state for his leadership on this bill. I think he'll walk through it. We'll see. We're going to know that in the coming weeks. So that's kind of the state of play right now. And I think that Senator Manchin also appreciates the historic nature of this, how consequential it is, how existential it is. He's starting to kind of wrap his head around that. Last observation, people also focus on Kyrsten Sinema and where will she be on this. I'm pretty confident that if we get to this rules change stage, and if Joe Manchin is comfortable with it and the broad caucus is comfortable with it, that Senator Sinema will also be comfortable with that change. So we're in a pretty good place, and we're here, as I say, because the public just refused to give up. I mean, every time we had these votes on moving forward that the Republicans blocked, normally the reaction in the chamber is, well, that's it, we're done. You know, we can't get past the filibuster. But every time it's been blocked, the immediate reaction from Democrats has been, we're not giving up. Like, there's got to be a way to get this done. And if you're saying there's got to be a way, and you know you can't get 10 Republicans, you're basically saying we got to change the rules. So they've gotten themselves in that headspace. They're moving towards that. And we're trying to do everything we can to reinforce that. And that gives us real prospects for success.
Great, thanks. Okay, so then we have a couple of questions about that mentioned gerrymandering. So if the Freedom to Vote Act passes, will it make all the gerrymandering laws that have now passed illegal? Will it permit rolling back the extreme gerrymanders in North Carolina, Ohio, Texas that have been forced through with Republican legislatures?
Yeah. The short answer is yes, and that's why it's so important to pass this bill. It contains standards that make sure that whoever's drawing lines, whether it's a commission, whether it's a state legislature, whether it's a court, they have to observe certain basic principles. They got to recognize communities of interest. They have to observe the boundaries of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And they have to do it in a way that doesn't trip a kind of hyper-partisan wire. And if you look across the country, in many of these states like Texas, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Florida, there's about 10 or 12 states where Republicans have been very transparent about their agenda to draw congressional lines in a way that is very partisan and frankly doesn't represent the voters of their state in any meaningful way. If that is allowed to stand, not only is it anti-democratic and offensive to voters, but it in effect will rig the 2022 midterms make it impossible for Democrats to prevail in those midterms. We're already seeing readouts of what the implications of this are around the country. So if we get the bill passed, those standards would apply. It would have been ideal to get the bill passed before these maps were being drawn, because then, in terms of litigation and all the rest of it, it would have been an easier lift. But the fact that in some places they've already been published, these maps, doesn't mean that we can't challenge them. So there will be a lot of litigation directed at these places based on those standards. But at the end of that process, you will have substantially corrected for this partisan gerrymandering stampede that we're seeing across the country. And that's just another important element of making sure our democracy is accountable.
So let's take a little step to, away from those pieces of legislation. And we have a question here that says, you accept no PAC or corporate money. How can your Democratic colleagues be convinced to do the same so that the Democratic Party is clearly seen as working for the people and not big money?
Well, in fact, there's upwards now, I think, of 70 or 80 members of Congress that are corporate PAC free. When I started doing this years ago, I think I'm now 12 years into being completely PAC free, not just corporate PACs, but zero PACs at all. And I did it back then because I was just kind of curious whether you could survive in American politics without taking PAC money, and I managed to this far. But since then, I think you've seen a great uptake, and really within the last 2 or 3 election cycles, there's been a recognition by candidates. Typically they're challengers, although you're getting more incumbents that themselves are taking this corporate PAC-free pledge. But usually it's the newcomers who are grabbing onto this, and they saw that it was very powerful with the public, and that it established sort of instant credibility about your desire to actually go to Washington and make public policy based on what the public wants to see, not based on what your sort of money patrons wanted to see. So I think we've made great progress there, and I think we'll continue to make progress. But you have to also create different ways for candidates to raise money. Just the other day in Baltimore County, we had an announcement. The county executive is launching a fair elections fund there to support public financing. Obviously, you have it in Montgomery County. We've seen it in Howard County. It's on the books in Baltimore City, et cetera. You have to find another place for candidates to raise money in order to be viable and competitive, so they don't have to go hat in hand to the PACs and the big donors. We can do that, and actually there's still included within the Freedom to Vote Act and a fund that will support democracy investments that states want to pilot. And it includes state efforts to pilot small donor public financing. So if we can get the bill passed, we can actually start to see this experimentation happening at the federal level, which would be terrific. Before I make it sound like I'm a saint when it comes to money in politics, I don't take corporate PAC money. I don't take any PAC money, but I take a lot of high donor money because I have to sort of supplement the hole that creates. I don't like doing that. That's why I support the idea of a small donor matching system. If you look at corporate PAC money as sort of the dirty fossil fuel of election finance, and small donor matching as like, the sort of clean green energy side of campaign finance. Maybe high donors are like the natural gas transition, I don't know. But ultimately we want to get to where candidacies are supported by the people. And frankly, what we know, the research shows us, and the experience of these systems across the country, is it adds tremendously to the diversity of the candidate pool. We see more women running, we see more people of color running and being successful, because you don't have to have a lot of money of your own or be able to access it in order to be competitive as a candidate. That's exactly what we should be promoting, not just at the state and local level, but in Washington as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that state courts, in addition to lower federal courts, will issue rulings defending voting rights, ballot access, aggressive list purging? And what would be the impact of McConnell's packing the courts? We all saw, no movement in the Senate, but we saw tons of confirmations, essentially, for courts all over the country. So, what is the effect of that as well?
So, I think that if we can get this bill passed, it will substantially fortify not just democratic infrastructure across the country, but help to foster anew a kind of democratic culture. It'll become harder, given the standards and norms that we're going to try to set in a uniform way across the country, for this mischief, for this kind of these insidious efforts to undermine, sort of like water corroding the foundation of a house, undermine our system. There'll be more accountability. It'll be harder to hide the ball. We have requirements in there like you can't change the location of a polling place at the last minute because some official that wants to wreak havoc knows that you can hide that as just some kind of logistic or administrative thing that needed to be done when in fact there's a voter suppression goal in mind. So I think if you create that broad culture, then all the courts will be stepping into an environment where their ability to protect those standards is enhanced. In terms of the Supreme Court, what we're quite confident about is that the way the bills have been drafted, particularly the Freedom to Vote Act, because it's based on the Elections Clause of the Constitution, which gives Congress the authority to regulate the time, place, and manner of federal elections across the country. We're pretty confident that we can withstand a challenge in the Supreme Court on most of what's contained within the Freedom to Vote Act, even with the current members of the court. In fact, Justice Roberts has invited Congress on many occasions to use the power it has in the Elections Clause, which is exactly what we're doing. When it comes to transparency of big money, Justice Scalia was the one who wrote most of the language in various opinions saying that transparency is absolutely constitutional. So we think we're in a good place. We know for sure that if the bill passes, it'll get challenged immediately the next day, but we think we can survive those challenges in terms of the constitutionality of the bill. And again, that'll keep it strong over time.
Couple questions here about the filibuster. Are Manchin and Sinema on board for changing the filibuster? We touched on it a little bit before, but I have a couple questions here about
what I would say is that Manchin's the key player here. And if he moves, I think Sinema's also going to be receptive. And I would say, as far as Manchin's concerned, that he's absolutely having those conversations. And it doesn't mean he's made any commitments yet. But at the beginning of the summer, he had staked out a pretty hard position that left people convinced that there was no hope. And he has moved significantly. And I think it's a combination, as I say, of him realizing the Republicans are not going to be there in this moment of crisis for our democracy. The fact that he now has his own ownership of the legislation that they are rejecting. The fact that in his own state, he's being celebrated for that leadership. All of these are ingredients that I think make it more likely that he will entertain a change to the rules that will allow us to get this bill over the finish line. The exact contours of what that will be, I can't predict. I mean, there's 50 different ways, permutations on what that could look like. But at the end of the day, what we're going for is the notion that while there can be an opportunity for extended debate in the United States Senate, extended debate cannot be endless debate. And at a certain point, you have to be able to call the question and then have a vote that's determined based on a simple majority. If you can't have that, then you can't have a functioning democracy. That's what the public understands. That's what we understand. I think we can get to the United States Senate to where they understand that as well. So I remain cautiously optimistic that we'll get there.
Okay. And for the 2022 election, are we, if you could do a little prediction here for us, are we at risk of losing House and Senate seats that you know of? If so, to what extent? What's your overall prediction there?
Yeah, we are. The midterms coming off of a president of one party being elected, in terms of the impact on that party, historically, it's severe. And depending on which kind of resource you consult, that average can be from anywhere from 18 seats lost to 26 seats lost, et cetera. So looking at historic trends, you're always swimming upstream in the midterms if it's the president's party that we're talking about. And we'll be doing it when the margins are like super, super thin. In the House, we can afford to have, 3 or 4 seats flip. In the Senate, it's 50-50. So the margins are very thin. You have headwinds historically. The Republican sound machine and propaganda empire continues to operate unabated, and frankly is fortified by the fact that they don't feel any compunction about telling lies. I mean, if you think about it, if you're willing to lie, you have all these additional tools in your toolkit when you go out there to sell your product. Mm-hmm. And if you want to see what that looks like, what that toolkit looks like, you've got 8 hours and 38 minutes of Kevin McCarthy's speech on the floor of the House last night, because he laid it all out. Every talking point they're going to use between now and next November was there. And it was there because Fox News and all of their machinery is very aligned in terms of how they do their messaging. So it's going to be a very tough climate. I do, however, believe that we can overcome it. I particularly think that if we can get this legislation through and thereby kind of pull back the structural advantage that the Republicans are trying to create for next year's election and beyond, that we can be extremely competitive. What I like about the voting reforms is it not only creates the machinery that can allow us to win, because if you get rid of voter suppression, if you have fair districts that get redrawn, if you push back on the big money influence and so forth, it's going to make you more competitive. But it's also the message that can win. The polling shows that nothing activates the sort of core activists in the Democratic Party like this legislation. And if we can get it passed, I think it will immediately inject energy into the Democratic Party across the country in ways that will help us organize faster and better than we've maybe ever seen before. So if you have the message of delivering on democracy to push you forward, if you created the machinery of access that allows people to show up, a diverse electorate to show up, and then, as I said at the outset, if you can present and sort of deliver to people all the good things, I mean deliver in terms of letting them know all the good things that we've achieved with the American Rescue Plan, with the infrastructure bill, and ultimately with Build Back Better, that's a pretty good portfolio to have as you walk into the voting booth, or make your case to the electorate next year. So it's going to be a tough election everywhere. And, you know, I don't want to sort of deceive anybody about that, but we can win it. We just got to get some important policy wins under our belt to make sure that we are as competitive as we can possibly be.
We have 2 minutes, and I have 2 quick questions.
Yeah.
One is another prediction, but what do you think Heather Mazur's shot at beating Andy Harris is in that highly gerrymandered district?
Well, of course, the redistricting is happening in Maryland now, and that in some ways impacts that. So we'll see where the legislature lands. We have a 7-1 map now that's not real pretty. I'm quite sensitive to that because my district's the one that kind of gets held up on late night TV shows. So the threshold question is, you know, do you try to clean up the 7-1 map, make it look better? Or do you go try to create an 8-0 map, which would allow the first district to be more competitive? So that conversation is happening right now, I gather, in the legislature. To make the first district more competitive, I think everyone recognizes you have to bring the first district over the Bay and into Anne Arundel County, for example. So, you know, there can be some challenges with that. So it depends how the district gets drawn, how competitive Heather can be, assuming we haven't had the primary yet, so we don't know that she'll be the nominee, but if she were the nominee, whoever the nominee is for the Democrats, and however the district gets drawn, it's not going to be an easy race to win. So I think there's still some unknowns there before anybody can kind of make even an inaccurate prediction. So I'll kind of reserve on that.
Okay, great. And then just last item here is what's 1 or 2 things that you would have all of us do here to help with all the work that you're doing and just, you know, democracy work in general?
I think you just have to make it clear to all you know that you are demanding this change. And I would connect yourselves if you're not already connected. I'm sure most of you are because we've been talking about this for a long time. But there are groups out there like End Citizens United, Common Cause, Democracy 21, and others that are channeling volunteers through calls, emails, letters, texts to the places where that advocacy needs to be heard. And to be honest, it's with Democratic members of the Senate because the Republicans, they're not part of this. They've walked away from our democracy. Not even, they not only have walked away from our democracy, they're running towards an autocracy. So they're not part of this conversation. So this is about making sure that Democrats understand that with the power they have, and they do have it, to get these critical reforms in place, there's no excuse for not doing it. There's no excuse. It's like, you've probably heard me use this metaphor before. Maybe I'll finish with it. The house of democracy is on fire. The Democrats are standing on the front lawn. We have everything we need to put that fire out. We have the axes, we have the fire hoses, everything. On the other side of the street, with their arms folded like this, is Mitch McConnell and the Republicans. For a while there, we had some in our caucus who were saying, we shouldn't pick up these hoses and put out the fire unless we can get some of the arsonists from across the street to come over and join us. And I think there's an increasing realization that's not happening. If we have the power to put out this fire, how will history treat us if we don't do it? We've got to pick up those fire hoses. We've got to put out that fire. We've got to do it for the sake of our democracy. And ultimately, I think that realization is going to carry the day. But all your efforts to echo that, to spread the word, the gospel about what is in this bill and why it's so important and existential in these closing weeks of this years-long journey. I mean, we've been climbing Mount Everest in the middle of a blizzard for years. That can make the difference. So thank you for getting us to this point. Thank you for your interest. We will continue to fight for this, and I'm hopeful that we'll get it over the finish line.
Wow, thank you so very much. Representative John Sarbanes, thank you. You're such a tireless advocate and public servant, and we're really lucky to have you with us today. You've spent, I really enjoyed so much of what you have, and really this language that you talked about the gaps in the infrastructure of our democracy, and clearly you're fighting so hard, and we're excited to join you. So thank you again for coming.
Bye-bye.
Today. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to wrap up. We want to just remind you that we do have another exciting event coming up on Tuesday, November 30th at 12:30 p.m. with Jennifer Rubin. If you haven't already registered, please go to our website and you will see the registration link there. And our membership drive is also going on. If you haven't renewed, please renew. And it will save us a call to you later on, because we're just starting to call through our list. So thanks again, everyone. We hope that you have a great day. We don't usually do Friday events, but I can say thanks so much and have a great weekend as well.
Thank you.
Good program, Leslie. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. And thanks to Barbara Zelenko and our whole team as well for helping to put this together.
Excellent.
Thank you. This was most informative.
We need to get a social media blitz going on this.
All good ideas there. Thanks so much, everyone.